Hi, folks. I wanted to continue on in my series of my journey of ministering to a transsexual Christian. And today, what I want to do is continue on with providing you with some cheat codes that you can use to have meaningful conversations with others about this topic. So I have a number of slides that are prepared. And so let's just go ahead and jump into those. So the acrostic that we use to help us to remember how to have meaningful conversations with those about transgenderism is binary, B-I-N-A-R-Y. And the B stands for biology, the I stands for impossibility, the N stands for natural, the A stands for alignment, the R, reality, and the Y, yourself. And so we're going to be looking at this whole issue of natural today. And I'll probably do this in 2 steps. And so then we'll have one session today and another one at the next time around. But when it comes to transgenderism, that the claim that I'm making here is that it is unnatural, and it's unnatural for a number of reasons. It's unnatural because it harms the functioning of our bodies, the natural functioning of our bodies. It harms our understanding of gender, and it harms the flourishing of society. So let's go to this point about how transgenderism, particularly gender-affirming surgery, harms the functioning of our bodies. When it comes to transitioning from girl to woman, is that typically girls don't need any medical interventions to transition into women. It's what their bodies do naturally. That's how their bodies are pre-programmed for them to negotiate and navigate adolescence from being a child to being a woman. Now, it's true that some girls experience delayed puberty, and that occurs in about 2 to 3% of the population. But the fact remains is that a girl's body is set up to transition naturally into a woman. So when it becomes the question of men becoming women, and I put that becoming intentionally in quotes because men, as we've talked about before, do not become women. That it's a biological, medical impossibility, and that while certainly a man can take on the appearance of a woman following certain treatments, is that he does not become a woman, either with hormone replacement therapy or sex reassignment surgery. Now, while our bodies naturally produce one type of hormone, estrogen for females and testosterone for males, with gender-affirming hormone therapy, the body's natural hormone process is short-circuited with chemical substitutes. When a man desists from treatment, his body will begin producing testosterone naturally. And this is what happened to Chris, is that when he desisted from hormones, that he has since stepped back into hormone replacement therapy. The best of my knowledge, I mean, I heard from him a few weeks ago that was the case. What happened with him is that his body once again began producing testosterone naturally, and he began to exhibit some of the effects of that natural production of his testosterone. So that going back to our slides here, when it comes to sex reassignment surgery or gender affirmation surgery, is that with orchiectomy, the testicle removal, and vaginoplasty, penile inversion, men do not become women. They become surgically altered men and remain men. And while they may have the appearance of being a woman, just from, either an external observer or even a medical inspection, is that their fundamental biology, their chromosomes and gamete anatomy, and all that means is that our bodies are set up to produce one or the other of the gametes that we need for reproduction. And in females, it's the egg, and in males, it's the sperm. And we have, not only our hormones and our anatomy that are set up that way, but and none of that changes. Well, you can certainly alter certain aspects of the anatomy. There's not a full-scale change that takes place with respect to this transition, and certainly not at the chromosome level either. So what happens with that is that as a result of the gender affirmation surgery is that a man will undergo certain irreversible changes. Now, certain surgical procedures, we're talking about bottom surgery here, and that results in changes and sterilization for transgender persons. When it comes to hormone replacement therapy, infertility often after 1 to 2 years of staying on hormones, and that infertility will result after that. And certain other health risks may also arise. So the question then becomes, is gender affirmation surgery mutilation? Some say yes, and others say no. And I guess that depends a lot on how you define mutilation. The definition for mutilation, you can look this up online or in dictionaries yourself, is that the definition of mutilation is the act of destroying, removing, or severely damaging the form or function of a body part, especially when that body part was previously healthy or intact. This term is often used to describe actions that are intentional and result in permanent, significant disfigurement or impairment. And so when we come back to this question of is gender affirming surgery mutilation, some will say no. And to make that argument, they have the backing of many leading health organizations, that many leading health organizations reject the label that these surgeries are mutilation, viewing gender affirmation surgery as simply a reconstructive surgery akin to other reconstructive surgeries. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Now, these voluntary procedures are safe, they claim, and effective for reducing dysphoria. So others will say, yes, gender affirmation surgery, although it's chosen by the patient to relieve gender dysphoria, these surgeries always destroy the form and function of the natural primary sex organ. Neo-organs cannot function in the same way. So in other words, what the surgeon constructs is called a neo-organ, is that those neo-organs cannot function in the same way or to the same degree as their natural counterparts. So the claim is that gender affirmation surgery is not reconstructive. Well, I think in order to sort our way through this is that we have to ask some additional questions. One of those being, what about the medical establishment's current position on gender affirming surgery? And I think that to explore that question a little bit more in depth, we would have to ask another question, is that has the medical establishment ever been wrong in the past? For instance, cigarette ads that boast being physician approved, and lobotomies, which were endorsed by the American Psychological Association in the 1940s. Both of these were accepted by the medical establishment, as well as a number of other practices and protocols that we could cite. So just because the medical establishment views a protocol or practice in a certain way does not necessarily mean that that's best to think of that in that way. Another question along these lines with respect to the acceptance by the medical establishment, and that's the question is, has the medical establishment ever been driven by political pressures to adopt particular practices or protocols? And of course, that anybody with a moment's reflection on what took place in 2020 is that we can remember the various COVID protocols and practices of requiring masks and social distancing of 6 feet, and some of these other things that and whether or not that you your thoughts about the COVID vaccine is that the fact of the matter is that the medical establishment adopted certain practices and protocols based on political pressure rather than that that's the best science that of the day. And so these things happen, and well, we shouldn't be so naive to think that such things couldn't happen with respect to this question of gender-affirming surgery. Now, another question that we could ask is that how does the destruction of the natural form and function of body parts impact the patient? Because what happens in every case of bottom surgery when it comes to gender affirmation surgery is that these procedures, and particularly when we're talking about men, is that they excise or repurpose healthy tissue, leading to sterilization and permanent loss of original reproductive sexual capabilities. And the same, of course, goes for women that have the phalloplasty procedure done. But what I think we need to think in terms of is that how does this impact the patient? And well, it may serve their sense of gender dysphoria. Is this really in the best interest of the patient, even though that is a particular outcome? And I think we need to think more clearly about that, or at least more carefully about that. And of course, in addition to the permanent loss of the organ and also sterilization, that complications are common, including strictures, fistulas, and reduced sensation or orgasm quality. Patients may experience problems with urination and sexual performance. So these are just, some of the realities of these procedures. And here again, we like to think that all of this is so cut and dried, but the fact of the matter is that there are a lot of things that end up complicating a lot of things that could complicate the life of the individual who undergoes the procedure. Now, another question, another point that I'd like to just explore for a moment is this whole idea of gender affirming surgery being reconstructive. And I just don't see, personally, I just don't see, I'm talking about myself here, I don't see how that you can make that argument that it's reconstructive. And I guess you could, one might make the argument that it's cosmetic. And I'm not going to get lost in the weeds of that, whether it's cosmetic. But I think clearly it's not reconstructive. There was no trauma to the body part, that there's no trauma that existed before the surgery. So, for instance, somebody who has a limb that is severed and the surgeon seeks to reattach it, that's reconstructive surgery, and to restore the body to its previous form or function. But gender affirming surgeries don't fall into that class. Gender affirming surgery creates a novel anatomy, and really what it is, it's an artificial organ. It's called a neo organ, and even though it's constructed from human tissue, is that it was not necessary with respect to that there was some sort of damaged original. It was not fixing or reconstructing a damaged original. Furthermore, the reason why gender affirming surgeries are classed reconstructive is that there's an aspect of insurance reimbursement that goes along with this. And so insurance coverage often hinges on medically necessary framing, potentially inflating benefits for reimbursement. So in other words, that the medical practitioner will say that this is medically necessary for this individual's benefit and welfare. And so that's how these surgeries get covered by insurance. But even a nose job, if you stop and think about it, even a nose job may be declined by insurance if it's solely for the patient's emotional well-being versus a functional reason. And it seems to me that, and here again, I'm not an expert, I'm just a guy who's trying to sort this out in my own thinking. But it seems to me that that gender-affirming surgeries fall into that category of an individual seeking it for their own personal emotional well-being, rather than it being medically necessary, because it's certainly not necessary with respect to an individual's function, their body part function. As a matter of fact, as I've talked about, is that what these surgeries do is that they're always a step down from a previously functional organ, at least in theory, okay, is that I realize that you could press the argument that that's not true in every case, but it's always a step down from a previously functional organ to one that now has an impaired function. And so this is certainly true with respect to Chris. As I mentioned, is that he had fathered 4 children. And so with respect to the function of his body part, that it seemed to be working perfectly fine. After his gender-affirming surgery, that capacity was no longer present, and that the capacity of his body had been forever changed and forever impaired. Would that classify as mutilation? I'll just let you figure that out for yourself. But also, here's something that I think is interesting to explore, and we'll talk about this in an upcoming broadcast, is that doesn't gender-affirming surgery put undue pressure upon the larger society to recognize a man as a woman, despite the resulting change being merely that of appearance? So in other words, the individual seeks out gender-affirming surgery because of, and I believe that the emotional distress that the person with gender dysphoria has is real. I believe that that's real, and I certainly do not diminish or deride someone who is experiencing emotional distress as a result of that condition. And so that individual then seeks out surgery to eliminate that dysphoria. Let's go ahead and grant that surgery is completely, just from the standpoint of eliminating the dysphoria, let's go ahead and grant that that's completely the outcome. But what that then does, so now that individual has a sense of congruence with his or her mental state and his or her bodily appearance. So there's congruence there. Okay, I understand that. But haven't we, by putting a person in that position, haven't we created a situation where we believe, or we want to act, that it's incumbent upon the rest of society to agree with that individual's self-perception? You see, gender affirmation surgery affirms the individual's self-perception. However, that does not obligate the rest of society to act as if that self-perception is true. Now, at the end of the day, is that we're in a situation with respect to the outcomes of gender-affirming surgery that is certainly complicated. At the end of the day, gender-affirming surgery destroys natural body parts to construct neo-organs in their place. And those neo-organs cannot function as their natural counterparts did, or as the natural counterparts do in people who are living consistently with their biology. Gender-affirming surgery leaves individuals in a permanent state where they are not only deprived of the natural form and function of their body parts, but also face a society that, I believe that legitimately so, is not obligated to share their self-understanding. Now, that's a difficult place to be in, because I do think that there's, to a certain extent, that there's the expectation that the balance of society must agree with the self-perception of the individual who has gender dysphoria, and particularly now that appearance is that of the opposite sex. But I don't think that incumbency is warranted on the rest of society. So we're exploring this whole issue of transgenderism and is it unnatural? And we have talked today about how that gender affirming surgeries and also hormone replacement therapies and how those harm the functioning of our bodies. And next time around, we'll pick up and talk about how that the whole gender affirming surgeries or pathway is that how that harms our understanding of gender. In the meantime, what I want to do is help equip you with learning how to have meaningful conversations with others on this topic. And let's remember our acrostic of the BINARY, binary acrostic, and the N stands for natural. And that when it comes to the treatments for gender dysphoria, moving ahead with hormone replacement or gender affirming surgeries, these do not follow a natural path for that individual. So we'll explore more of this in our upcoming sessions. But in the meantime, I appreciate you thinking with me about how to have meaningful conversations with individuals with respect to this topic. And remember, we must always love people deeply, but also learn to think